a homeless woman, struggling to survive on the streets, forms an unexpected bond with a stray dog, one that will change both their lives forever. When a homeless black woman saves a stray dog from a cruel attack, what happens next will leave you speechless. The dog's shocking past is revealed, and their journey together takes a heartbreaking turn that no one saw coming. Before we get into this unforgettable story, make sure you're subscribed to Epic Story Moments. Don't forget to hit that bell so you never miss another amazing tale. If you enjoy the story, like, share, and leave a comment. It helps us bring more heartwarming stories your way. And we'd love to know, where are you watching from? Let's stay connected. Sophia walked the crowded streets of the city, her shoulders hunched against the biting wind. The towering buildings and bustling crowds offered no comfort, only a reminder of how invisible she was to those around her. She clutched a tattered bag filled with her few possessions, her weathered hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the thin scarf around her neck. Sophia had learned to survive in the cracks of the city, scavenging for food from dumpsters behind restaurants and finding shelter in abandoned buildings that offered little more than a reprieve from the elements. Her days were a cycle of struggle, each one blending into the next. The world moved around her, vibrant and alive, but she remained unseen, a ghost among the living. People passed by with hurried steps and averted eyes, unwilling to acknowledge her presence. She had grown accustomed to the indifference, but it still stung, a quiet ache she carried in her chest. One evening, as she rummaged through a pile of discarded cardboard near the market, a faint whimper caught her attention. Sophia paused, her sharp ears attuned to the sound. She followed it to a narrow alley, where she found a scruffy dog huddled near a pile of trash. Its ribs were visible beneath its matted fur, and its brown eyes were filled with a mix of fear and desperation. "Hey there, boy," Sophia murmured, crouching down slowly. The dog flinched at first, its tail tucked tightly between its legs, but it didn't run. Sophia reached into her bag and pulled out a small piece of bread she had saved from earlier. She held it out, her hand steady despite the cold. The dog hesitated, sniffing the air cautiously before inching closer. It snatched the bread from her hand and retreated a few steps, devouring it quickly. Sophia smiled faintly, a warmth spreading through her chest that she hadn't felt in a long time. "You're hungry, just like me," she said softly. From that moment, the dog began following her. She named him Buddy, a simple name for a companion she didn't know she needed. They became inseparable, sharing scraps of food and seeking warmth together on frigid nights. Buddy's presence brought a flicker of light to Sophia's otherwise bleak existence. He wagged his tail when she spoke, rested his head on her lap when they sat together, and barked at anyone who came too close, as if protecting her from the world's cruelties. But the city remained unkind. People glanced at Sophia and Buddy with disdain or pity, their gazes sliding away as quickly as they came. One day, a woman passing by sneered, "Get that filthy dog out of here," before walking away without waiting for a response. Sophia held Buddy close, murmuring reassurances as if to shield him from the harshness of the words. Despite the indifference and judgment, Sophia and Buddy formed their own little world, a fragile, fleeting connection that made the city feel a little less cold. For the first time in years, Sophia didn't feel entirely alone. She had Buddy, and for now, that was enough. Sophia and Buddy's routine of survival was harsh, but they managed to find small moments of solace together. Buddy's wagging tail and warm eyes reminded Sophia of a time when life wasn't so relentlessly unforgiving. One evening, as the sun dipped below the skyline, Sophia walked to a nearby park where they often found quiet corners to rest. The air was crisp, and a faint golden glow bathed the city streets. Buddy had wandered a short distance away, sniffing at the base of a tree. Sophia smiled faintly, watching him with a sense of pride. He was growing stronger under her care. Suddenly, his sharp yelp broke the calm. Sophia turned quickly to see a group of teenagers gathered around Buddy in the shadows of an alley. They were laughing as one of them poked at Buddy with a stick, while another threw small rocks, aiming to scare him. Buddy cowered, his tail tucked tightly against his body as he whimpered. "Hey, stop that!" Sophia shouted, her voice cutting through the commotion. She rushed toward them, her steps quick despite her worn shoes and aching knees. The teenagers turned to her, their expressions shifting from amusement to mockery. One of them, a tall boy with a hood pulled low over his face, sneered, "What's it to you, lady?" "It's just a dirty mutt." Sophia didn't falter. She stood her ground, her protective instincts flaring. "He's mine, and you leave him alone," she said firmly, her voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath it. Buddy scrambled behind her, pressing against her legs for safety. The teenagers exchanged glances before one of them muttered something under his breath. They backed off, but not before the leader grabbed a handful of her belongings. A small bag she carried everywhere. They laughed as they ran off into the night. Sophia stood frozen for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest. She looked down at Buddy, who was trembling. She knelt beside him, running her hands gently over his fur to comfort him. "It's okay, boy. They're gone now," she whispered, though her own voice shook with the weight of her loss. Her bag had contained everything she had in the world. A few coins, an old photograph of her family, and a blanket that had been her only source of warmth during long, cold nights. The theft left her not only vulnerable, but deeply hurt. It wasn't just about the material loss. It was a reminder of how easily people could strip away the little she had left. As the night stretched on, Sophia and Buddy wandered aimlessly, searching for a place to rest. The city seemed more hostile than ever, its bright lights casting harsh shadows on her fragile existence. Meanwhile, a new threat loomed over the homeless community. Across town, in a sleek high-rise office, Mr. Carter, a wealthy businessman, unveiled his latest initiative, a campaign to clean up the streets. On the surface, it was framed as a noble effort to improve the city's image, but the underlying goal was clear: to remove the homeless population and reclaim the spaces they occupied for lucrative development projects. Mr. Carter was a commanding figure with sharp features and a calculated demeanor. His speeches, delivered with polished confidence, painted the homeless as a blight on the city, emphasizing the need for order and progress. His words were met with applause by the city's elite, who saw his vision as an opportunity to elevate property values and attract new investors. For people like Sophia, this campaign spelled disaster. Flyers were posted around the city, warning of increased patrols and the dismantling of encampments. The few safe havens Sophia had relied on were now at risk of being taken away. As she sat on the steps of an old building with Buddy curled up beside her, Sophia's gaze lingered on one of the flyers fluttering against a lamppost. The words, "A better city for all," stared back at her mockingly. She felt a swell of anger and helplessness. The city wasn't better for people like her. It was a place where survival was a daily battle, and now even that was being threatened. Sophia held Buddy close, her fingers brushing against his fur as she whispered, "We'll figure this out, Buddy. We always do." But deep down, she wondered how much longer she could hold on in a world that seemed determined to push her down. Sophia and Buddy's days were becoming more precarious with each passing moment. The city felt like a tightening grip, squeezing the life out of its most vulnerable inhabitants. After the teenagers had stolen her bag, Sophia had to start from scratch. With nowhere to turn, she spent her days wandering the city in search of food, and her nights finding makeshift shelters to keep her and Buddy safe. Buddy, despite the hardships, remained a source of comfort and strength for Sophia. His loyalty was unwavering, and his gentle nuzzles against her hand seemed to say, "We'll get through this together." They moved as a unit now. Buddy was Sophia's shadow, always alert to their surroundings, while Sophia protected him from the dangers that lurked in every corner of the city. But Mr. Carter's campaign was making their already difficult existence nearly impossible. Brightly colored flyers and digital billboards plastered the city, proclaiming, "Asterisk, take back our streets, a better city for all." Asterisk, they were accompanied by patrols of uniformed officers tasked with clearing out homeless camps. Tents were torn down, makeshift shelters dismantled, and people were forced to scatter into the night. Sophia had seen it firsthand 2 nights ago. She and Buddy had found refuge beneath an overpass, joining a small group of other homeless individuals who huddled together for warmth. They were awakened by harsh flashlights and booming voices demanding they leave immediately. Panic erupted as people grabbed what they could and ran. Sophia clutched Buddy tightly and bolted, her heart pounding as she navigated the dark streets. Now, she avoided the main thoroughfares, keeping to alleys and back roads. She had learned to recognize the signs of an impending sweep: the distant murmur of engines, the clipped tones of officers on radios. Her instincts were sharper than ever, but the constant vigilance was exhausting. One cold evening, as she and Buddy rested in the shadow of an old warehouse, Sophia overheard 2 men talking nearby. Their voices were low but animated, carrying through the still night air. She inched closer, staying hidden behind a stack of crates, and strained to listen. "You hear about that Carter guy's plan? It's working. They're clearing the camps faster than ever. Yeah, but it's not just the homeless he's after. Did you hear what his wife said at that gala last week? She's still heartbroken over that damn dog. What was its name again? Duke. Daisy. Duke. Yeah, the one that won all those trophies a few years back. Stolen right out of their backyard. She's convinced it's still out there somewhere." Sophia's breath caught in her throat. "Duke," she looked down at Buddy, who was snoozing peacefully beside her. Could it be possible? His behavior, his intelligence, and the way he seemed to carry himself, it all made sense now. Buddy wasn't just any stray. He might be the missing dog they were talking about. Her mind raced with the implications. If Buddy truly was Duke, the prize-winning dog stolen from a wealthy family, what would that mean for them? Returning him could lead to a reward, perhaps even a chance to escape this life. But it also meant risking losing him, the only companion she had left in the world. Sophia gently touched Buddy's fur, her fingers trembling. "What's your story, boy?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Buddy stirred and opened his eyes, looking at her with the same unwavering trust that had kept her going all this time. The night stretched on, but sleep didn't come for Sophia. Her mind was consumed with questions and fears. She knew that discovering the truth about Buddy could change everything, but it could also cost her the one thing she held most dear. The choice loomed over her like a storm cloud, and she couldn't shake the feeling that the next step she took would alter both their lives forever. The revelation about Buddy weighed heavily on Sophia, invading her thoughts with every passing hour. If Buddy truly was Duke, the stolen prize-winning dog, returning him to his original owners could mean an end to her suffering, a potential reward, or even a moment of recognition that she had done something good. But the thought of losing him felt unbearable. Buddy wasn't just a dog to her anymore. He was her family, her only source of warmth and companionship in a world that had shown her nothing but cold indifference. Sitting on the steps of an abandoned building one morning, Sophia watched Buddy as he sniffed curiously at the remnants of a torn newspaper. "What would they even be like?" she mused aloud. "The people who lost you? Would they even care about me? Or just take you and forget I existed?" Buddy looked up at her, his tail wagging slightly, as if he could sense her distress. Sophia sighed, resting her chin on her knees. The choice wasn't easy, and she wasn't sure she had the strength to make it. Meanwhile, the city was becoming increasingly hostile to people like Sophia. Mr. Carter's campaign to clean up the streets had escalated dramatically. Patrols now combed through areas day and night, dismantling encampments and scattering those who sought refuge. The places Sophia once considered safe were disappearing, and every corner of the city seemed to have eyes watching her. One night, she and Buddy were forced to flee yet again when officers showed up at a small park where they had settled for the evening. The sound of heavy boots and barked commands filled the air as Sophia clutched Buddy and slipped into the shadows, her heart pounding. They ran until her legs burned. finally collapsing in an alley far from the commotion. Her chest heaved as she struggled to catch her breath, and tears pricked her eyes. It felt as though the world was closing in on her, squeezing out any remaining space she had to exist. She reached out to Buddy, who licked her hand softly, grounding her in the moment. But even Buddy's comfort couldn't fully ease the weight on her mind. The loss of her few belongings and the confrontation with the teenagers still haunted her. The stolen bag had contained everything she held dear: the old photograph of her parents, a small notebook where she had scribbled fragments of poetry, and a scarf her grandmother had knitted for her long ago. Those items weren't just possessions. They were pieces of her identity, and now they were gone. The strain of it all began to take a toll on Sophia. She found herself snapping at Buddy over minor things, only to immediately apologize and break down in tears. "I'm sorry, boy," she whispered one night as they huddled together in the cold. "I didn't mean it. You're all I've got, and I don't know what I'd do without you." Her mind felt like a storm. Thoughts of Buddy's possible past, the relentless harassment by authorities, and the constant fight for survival swirled together, leaving her exhausted and frayed. There were moments when she wanted to give up, to let the city swallow her whole. But every time she looked at Buddy, his unwavering trust and loyalty reminded her that she had someone who depended on her, someone who believed in her even when she couldn't believe in herself. As the days passed, the city seemed to tighten its grip, with fewer places to hide and even fewer moments of peace. Sophia knew she couldn't keep running forever. Something had to change, but what? She glanced at Buddy, who rested his head on her lap, his soft brown eyes watching her as if sensing her turmoil. "Maybe your past holds the answers," she murmured, stroking his fur. "But what if it takes you away from me? What if I lose the only thing keeping me going?" Her voice trembled as she spoke, the words hanging in the air like an unspoken prayer. Deep down, Sophia knew she couldn't delay the inevitable. The choice to uncover Buddy's truth was coming closer, and with it, the fear of losing the one thing that had kept her alive through it all. Sophia's encounters with people had taught her to be wary. Most only saw her as another face on the street, an inconvenience to be ignored or swept away. But one afternoon, as she sat with Buddy outside a small community center, everything changed. Grace, a young woman in her early 30s with warm eyes and a kind smile, approached cautiously. Dressed in casual clothes and carrying a bag of supplies, she knelt down to Sophia's level. "Hi there," Grace said gently, her voice soft but steady. "I'm Grace. I work at the shelter down the block. I notice you've been here a few times. Is there anything you and your friend need?" Sophia looked at her suspiciously, her shoulders tensing. Experience had taught her that offers of help often came with strings attached, or worse, pity masked as kindness. She tightened her grip on Buddy's leash. "We're fine," she replied curtly, avoiding Grace's gaze. Grace didn't push. She placed a small bag of food and water on the ground and stood up. "Okay, I'll leave this here in case you change your mind." She hesitated, then added, "If you ever need a warm place for the night, come by the center. We're open until 10. As Grace walked away, Buddy sniffed the bag eagerly, his tail wagging. Sophia sighed and opened it, finding a sandwich, a bottle of water, and a small packet of dog treats. She fed Buddy first, watching him devour the treats with a wagging tail, and then took a tentative bite of the sandwich herself. Over the next few days, Grace returned regularly, each time bringing supplies and sitting down to chat. Sophia remained guarded, but found herself softening toward the young woman. Grace wasn't just kind, she was persistent, and her warmth felt genuine. Grace's efforts, however, weren't without obstacles. Back at the shelter, she faced pushback from the board of directors. Some members, influenced by the growing anti-homeless sentiment in the city, questioned the allocation of resources to people like Sophia. "We need to focus on families and people who can get back on their feet," one board member argued during a meeting. "She's just another case that will drain resources and bring trouble." Grace pushed back, her voice firm. "Everyone deserves dignity and compassion. She's a person, not a problem. Meanwhile, Mr. Carter's influence loomed over the city. In public, he spoke eloquently about progress and order, but privately, his motivations were far more personal. His hardened stance on homelessness stemmed from a painful chapter in his past. His younger brother, Daniel, had battled addiction and spent years on the streets before dying in a shelter. Carter's grief had curdled into resentment, and he now saw homelessness as a failure to be eradicated, rather than a condition to be understood. In his sleek office overlooking the city, Carter reviewed reports on the success of his campaign. He had no patience for dissenting voices like Grace's. To him, people like Sophia were obstacles to his vision of a thriving, clean city. Unaware of Carter's personal vendetta, Sophia continued to build an uneasy relationship with Grace. One evening, as the city grew colder, Sophia finally accepted Grace's invitation to visit the shelter. The building was warm and bustling with activity, a stark contrast to the harsh streets outside. Grace offered her a meal and a chance to rest in one of the quiet corners. Sophia reluctantly accepted, though she kept Buddy close by her side, her hand never leaving his leash. "You can trust me, you know," Grace said softly as they sat together. "I'm not here to judge you or take anything away." Sophia's eyes flickered with doubt. She had trusted before, only to be hurt. "People always say that," she muttered. Grace didn't press further, sensing Sophia's hesitation. Instead, she focused on Buddy. "He's a beautiful dog. Looks like he's been through a lot, though." Sophia stiffened but forced a small smile. "He's tough, like me." Grace laughed softly. "I can see that. If you ever want to talk, I'm here." Though Sophia appreciated Grace's kindness, she kept Buddy's secret to herself. Revealing his potential identity felt like too great a risk, especially when trust was something she couldn't afford to give lightly. Still, for the first time in a long while, she felt a glimmer of hope, a small, tentative belief that maybe, just maybe, not everyone in the world was out to harm her. The shelter had become a fragile sanctuary for Sophia and Buddy, a place where they could rest, even if only temporarily. Sophia still kept her guard up, but Grace's persistence and kindness were slowly chipping away at her walls. Buddy, ever intuitive, seemed to trust Grace completely, often wagging his tail and nudging her for pats whenever she came close. One evening, as Sophia dozed in the quiet corner of the shelter, Grace sat at her desk, sorting through donations. A small television in the background hummed with the local news. She wasn't paying much attention until a segment caught her ear. The mystery surrounding Duke, the prize-winning dog stolen from the Carter family estate, continues to baffle authorities. Duke was last seen 4 years ago, and the family remains hopeful for his safe return. Grace froze, her eyes locking on the screen. A photograph of a regal-looking dog filled the frame, and the resemblance was unmistakable. The glossy coat, the intelligent eyes, everything matched Buddy. Her heart raced as she quickly jotted down the details, including a hotline number displayed on the screen. The next morning, Grace approached Sophia cautiously. "Sophia," she began hesitantly, sitting down across from her. "I need to talk to you about Buddy." Sophia immediately tensed, her hand tightening on Buddy's leash. "What about him?" she asked warily. Grace took a deep breath. "I think Buddy might be Duke, the missing dog from that news story. His description, it matches perfectly. The timing, his appearance. Sophia, if he is Duke, there's a family out there who's been searching for him for years." Sophia's face hardened. "You've been watching the news about us?" Her voice was sharp, defensive. "I knew it was too good to be true." No, Grace said quickly, holding up her hands. "I'm not trying to betray you, Sophia. I thought you want to know. If this is true, it could mean something good for both of you." Sophia stood abruptly, pulling Buddy closer. "You don't get it. Buddy's all I have. If I give him up, what's left for me? Nothing. Just like always." The room fell silent, and for a moment, Grace didn't know what to say. Finally, She spoke softly. "I know you've been through a lot, but maybe this could be a chance for a fresh start. I can help you, Sophia. You don't have to do this alone." Sophia didn't respond. She turned and walked out of the shelter, Buddy trotting faithfully beside her. Her chest felt tight, her emotions a tangled knot of anger, fear, and confusion. Grace's words echoed in her mind, but the thought of losing Buddy was unbearable. As she wandered the streets, Sophia tried to imagine what life might be like without Buddy. The thought was like a physical ache. She stopped in an alley and sank to the ground, wrapping her arms around him. "What do we do, boy?" she whispered. "What if Grace is right? What if going back is the best thing for you?" Unbeknownst to Sophia, her decision was about to become even more complicated. That evening, as Grace researched further, she discovered something that made her blood run cold. The Carter family, Buddy's potential original owners, were directly tied to Mr. Carter, the very man spearheading the campaign against the homeless. He wasn't just an influential businessman. He was the brother-in-law of Buddy's owner. This revelation changed everything. Grace realized the situation wasn't just about a missing dog or a homeless woman trying to survive. It was about systemic injustice, prejudice, and a connection none of them had anticipated. Sophia's next steps would determine everything, but Grace knew one thing for sure. Mr. Carter's involvement would bring complications none of them were prepared for. The stakes had just been raised, and the story of Sophia and Buddy was about to take an unexpected turn. The next few days were a blur for Sophia. Her mind struggled to piece together everything she had learned about Buddy's past, the Carter family, and the growing tension in the city. Each time she saw Grace, the weight of the decision ahead grew heavier. Grace had insisted on sharing what she had uncovered, believing Sophia needed to know. But the truth was far more complicated than either of them had anticipated. One evening, as Sophia and Buddy wandered the streets near the shelter, Grace approached with a concerned look. She had something important to tell Sophia, but this time, the conversation was different. "Sophia," Grace began, her voice low, "there's more. I found out who Buddy really belongs to." Sophia felt her heart race, her hands tightening around Buddy's leash. "I thought you already told me everything." "I did," Grace said, but her expression darkened. "But I didn't tell you about Mr. Carter's late daughter. She was the one who owned Buddy. Her name was Emily." Sophia's brows furrowed in confusion. "Mr. Carter's daughter?" Grace nodded. Emily was an only child, and she adored Buddy. They were inseparable. When she died in a car accident a few years ago, Buddy was devastated. After her death, he disappeared from the family estate. No one knew what happened to him until now. The revelation hit Sophia like a punch to the gut. For years, Buddy had been a symbol of her own loss and survival. But now he seemed to embody something far more profound, a tangible connection to a family, a history of grief, and a man who had built his empire on a foundation of pain. Sophia's gaze dropped to Buddy, who was sitting beside her, his eyes following her every movement. "I never knew," Sophia whispered, her voice breaking. "He's more than just a dog to me. I never thought about what he meant to someone else." Grace placed a hand on Sophia's shoulder, her touch gentle. "It's a lot to take in, I know, but it's not just about Buddy. There's something bigger going on here." Sophia glanced up, sensing the shift in Grace's tone. "What do you mean?" Grace hesitated before continuing. "Buddy's been acting strange lately, like he's trying to tell us something. Last night, he bolted from the shelter and ran straight to the park where Mr. Carter's company has been buying up property. I followed him, and he led me right to a construction site, where I saw something I wasn't supposed to." Sophia's heart skipped a beat. "What did you see?" Grace lowered her voice even further. "There's an illegal operation happening there. It's tied to the homeless community. The city's been clearing out entire neighborhoods, but I think Mr. Carter's behind it. I'm not sure yet what exactly he's doing, but I found a few things. Documents that suggest Carter's company is involved in exploiting the homeless to make room for high-end developments." Sophia's stomach churned. The realization that the man who had been so intent on eradicating homeless communities was also linked to illegal practices left her feeling sick. Mr. Carter had no qualms about erasing people like her from the streets, but the idea that he was using his influence to manipulate and profit from the city's most vulnerable was something she hadn't even considered. As Sophia processed this, she turned to look at Buddy, who was sitting quietly at her feet. His eyes met hers, filled with a sense of knowing, as if he understood the danger they were now in. "What do we do now?" Sophia asked, her voice strained. "If we expose this, it'll ruin him. But he'll destroy us, too. He'll find a way to make us disappear." Grace didn't immediately answer. Her eyes clouded with uncertainty. "I think the truth has to come out, Sophia. The city needs to know what's happening. People like us can't just keep hiding while this man tears everything down." Sophia's mind raced. There were so many risks, so many ways it could go wrong. But there was also a sense of urgency inside her. Buddy, in his quiet way, had led her to the truth. Now she had to decide whether she would walk away from the fight, keeping herself safe but silent, or whether she would stand up to a man with the power to crush her and everything she cared about. For a long time, Sophia had fought for her survival alone. But now, with Buddy by her side, she wasn't sure if staying silent was the right choice. She had a voice, and she could use it to bring justice. Not just for Buddy, but for everyone like her who had been forgotten, discarded, and left to fend for themselves. "I can't let this go," Sophia finally said, her voice steady. "We need to expose him. Whatever happens, we have to stop him." The decision was made, and it felt both terrifying and liberating. Sophia was no longer just a woman struggling to survive. She was someone with a purpose, with a voice. And as she looked at Buddy, she knew that whatever the future held, they would face it together. The decision to confront Mr. Carter was a turning point for Sophia. She had spent years on the streets, never trusting anyone enough to reveal her vulnerabilities. But now, with Buddy's history tied to Mr. Carter's past, she knew she had to take action. This wasn't just about surviving anymore. This was about standing up to a man who represented everything she had fought against: power, indifference, and cruelty. The night before the confrontation, Sophia paced back and forth in the shelter, Buddy sitting at her feet. Grace had been her quiet support, helping her gather evidence and map out a plan. They knew they couldn't rely solely on Buddy's connection to the Carter family. Sophia needed to approach this with strategy, using the threat of exposure to gain leverage. "We're going to need everything," Grace said, her voice calm but firm as she handed Sophia a folder filled with printouts. Photos, documents, anything that shows Carter's corruption and exploitation of the homeless. "The more we have, the stronger our case will be." Sophia took the folder, her hands trembling slightly as she flipped through the evidence. It wasn't just a few pieces of paperwork. It was a damning collection of criminal activity and discrimination, spanning months of covert investigations. Each document painted a picture of a man more concerned with his wealth and influence than the lives of the people he was trampling. "Do you really think we can win against him?" Sophia asked, her voice laced with doubt. Grace placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We're not fighting for a win. We're fighting for the truth." The next morning, as Sophia made her way to Mr. Carter's office, the weight of what she was about to do settled heavily in her chest. She had spent years avoiding conflict, staying out of the public eye. But this time, she wasn't just a shadow on the streets. She was bringing the fight to the man who had tried to erase her, to erase people like her from existence. Buddy walked alongside her, his presence a comforting constant. As they reached the entrance to Carter's building, Sophia paused. The sleek glass doors and polished lobby seemed a world away from the alleyways she called home. But she took a deep breath and pushed forward. Inside, she was escorted to Carter's office. The receptionist, a young woman in her 20s, gave her a curious glance but didn't question her appearance. It wasn't unusual for people like Sophia to show up at the doors of the rich and powerful, but most were quickly turned away. Sophia's heart raced as she entered the office. Mr. Carter, dressed in an expensive suit, was standing by the window, looking out over the city. He turned as she entered, his expression hardening when he saw her. "What are you doing here?" His voice was cold, dismissive. Sophia felt the anger bubble up but forced herself to remain calm. She needed him to listen, not just to her, but to the truth. "I came to talk to you, Mr. Carter," she said, her voice steady. "About Buddy." Carter's eyes narrowed. "What about him?" Sophia stepped forward, holding out a photograph of Buddy as a young pup, the same one Grace had found. "This dog, his name is Buddy. He's not just some stray. He was your daughter's dog." Carter's face faltered for a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. "That's ridiculous," he scoffed. "You're lying." "I'm not lying," Sophia said, her voice stronger now. "I know who he is, and I know what happened to him. He was stolen, and you lost him when your daughter died. But you didn't just lose a dog. You lost a piece of your family." The mention of Emily hit Carter harder than Sophia had anticipated. His jaw clenched, and for the briefest moment, his cold exterior cracked. "Don't come in here with that nonsense. You don't know anything about me or my family." Sophia didn't back down. "I know everything about you, Mr. Carter, about the way you've been treating people like me, people on the streets. You've been using your power to destroy lives, to clear the homeless off the streets for your precious developments." Carter's anger flared. "You don't know anything about my work. You have no idea what it takes to run this city." "I know exactly what it takes," Sophia said, her voice rising. "It takes trampling over people who don't have the luxury of a fancy office or the means to fight back. It takes a man who's willing to exploit the most vulnerable for his own gain." She placed a folder of evidence on his desk. "This is what I found. This is what you're doing. And if you don't stop, I'll make sure the whole city knows about it." Carter looked at the folder, his face twisting with rage. "You think you can just walk in here and make threats? You think anyone will believe a homeless woman over me?" Sophia met his gaze, her determination unwavering. "I don't need anyone to believe me. The truth will speak for itself." Carter stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "You've made a grave mistake, Sophia. You don't know who you're messing with." For a moment, Sophia felt a surge of fear, but it quickly evaporated. She had made her choice. She was no longer afraid. "I know exactly who you are, Mr. Carter," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "And I'm not going anywhere." With those words, the tension between them thickened. Carter's gaze flickered between the evidence on his desk and Sophia's unyielding stance. The walls of his empire, so carefully built over the years, were beginning to crumble. But he wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. "I'll make sure you regret this," he spat, his voice dripping with venom. "You'll pay for this. Mark my words." Sophia turned and walked out of the office, Buddy at her side. The path ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. She had just made an enemy far more dangerous than she had ever imagined, and there would be no turning back. The days that followed Sophia's confrontation with Mr. Carter were fraught with tension. For the first time in years, Sophia felt the weight of her actions. She had taken a stand against one of the most powerful men in the city, and now she was being hunted. But what kept her going was a fire she felt within, the knowledge that she wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for every person who had ever been pushed to the margins, ignored, and discarded. Despite the growing danger, Sophia couldn't shake the nagging thought that Carter was starting to see her in a different light. She had seen it in his eyes when she left his office. The momentary flicker of something more than just anger. He hadn't just seen a homeless woman. He had seen someone with the same grief, the same longing, the same attachment to Buddy that he once shared with his daughter Emily. It wasn't a shift she had anticipated, but it was there, a subtle change. And with it came a glimmer of hope that even a man like Mr. Carter could change. Sophia knew that her actions, her refusal to back down, were forcing him to confront his own buried emotions. In the days that followed, she began to notice something in the way people spoke of him. Whispers, guilt, He was starting to question everything he had built. But even as his heart softened, the chase continued. Authorities were closing in. The citywide sweep of the homeless population had intensified, and with each passing hour, Sophia's chances of staying hidden grew slimmer. Grace had managed to get the evidence to some key reporters, but they couldn't protect her from what was coming next. One late afternoon, as Sophia and Buddy made their way through an alley near the outskirts of the city, the sound of footsteps echoed behind them. Sophia turned, her breath catching in her throat. A group of officers was fast approaching, their heavy boots pounding the pavement, their expressions stern. Before she could react, one of them called out, "Stop right there." Sophia's pulse quickened. She turned to Buddy, who had already started to back away, sensing the danger. Without a word, Sophia grabbed his leash and bolted down the alley, her heart racing in her chest. She knew the city's streets better than anyone, but this was different. This was a full-blown pursuit. She dodged through narrow passages, her breath coming in sharp gasps. Behind her, the officers called out, but she didn't look back. Every step was calculated, every move a desperate attempt to outrun the inevitable. At the end of the alley, a narrow staircase led to an abandoned rooftop. Without hesitation, Sophia sprinted up the stairs, her legs aching with the effort. As she reached the top, she looked back to see the officers closing in. This is it, Sophia thought, panic rising in her chest. I can't outrun them forever. But just as the officers reached the rooftop, Buddy barked loudly, drawing their attention. Sophia seized the moment and darted toward the edge of the roof. She could hear the officers' shouts as they scrambled after her, but she wasn't going to let them catch her. Not now. With a final burst of energy, Sophia jumped from the edge of the building to the fire escape below. She barely made it, her fingers slipping as she grabbed the bars, but she held on. Buddy followed closely behind, his paws scrambling for traction. Just as she reached the bottom, the sound of sirens filled the air. They were surrounded, but Sophia wasn't done yet. She ducked into a nearby crowd, blending in with the people who were walking down the street. The officers ran past, unaware of her presence, their faces obscured by the chaos. She took a deep breath and kept moving, but she didn't stop running. Sophia knew it wouldn't be long before they came looking for her again. The city was on edge, and Mr. Carter's influence was far-reaching. But she wasn't going to let fear stop her now. She had the evidence, she had the truth, and she was going to make sure it was seen. As Sophia rounded a corner, she spotted a group of reporters gathering in front of a newsstand. She knew she had to act fast. This was her chance. With Buddy by her side, she approached the crowd, making sure to keep her distance from the officers now searching the area. She walked up to one of the reporters, a woman with a camera slung over her shoulder. "I need to talk to you," Sophia said urgently, her voice low but filled with resolve. The reporter turned, her eyes widening in surprise. "Who are you?" "My name's Sophia," she said, pulling out the folder of evidence that had been hidden in her jacket. "And I have something you need to see." The reporter's eyes flickered to the folder, and then back to Sophia. Without saying a word, she took the papers from Sophia's hands. As she looked through the documents, her expression shifted from curiosity to shock. This is big," the reporter said, her voice filled with disbelief. "Are you sure about this?" Sophia nodded. "You have to make sure everyone knows what's been happening. People like me, we don't have a voice. But we do now." Just as the reporter prepared to make a call, the sound of sirens grew louder. Sophia's heart raced. They had found her. The officers were closing in. The reporter looked up, her face suddenly pale. "You need to go now." But Sophia was already running. She didn't have time to wait. She could hear the officers shouting, but the crowd had gathered around the reporter, and Sophia knew this was her moment. As she sprinted down the street, she glanced back one last time. The crowd was growing larger. People had stopped to watch, to listen. The news was spreading. The truth was about to break free. And as the officers reached the newsstand, Sophia disappeared into the chaos, her heart pounding in her chest, knowing that the fight was far from over. The fallout from the release of the evidence was swift and relentless. Within hours, the city was buzzing with the story. News outlets ran continuous coverage, broadcasting the damning reports of Mr. Carter's involvement in the corruption targeting the homeless. The once untouchable businessman, who had spent decades building his empire, was now the center of a media storm. Calls for his resignation came from all corners. Activists, politicians, and even some of his former allies turned on him. His campaign to clear the homeless from the streets began to unravel, as more and more people began to question his true motives. For Sophia, the victory was bittersweet. The streets had become a battleground, and though the fight had gained her some ground, it didn't erase the scars she had carried for so long. She watched the news with Buddy by her side, feeling a mixture of triumph and sorrow. The public outrage was a step in the right direction, but she knew that the change she had fought for was just the beginning. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't happen overnight. But for the first time in years, she had hope. Amidst the chaos, Sophia's decision to return Buddy to Mr. Carter was a quiet act of resolution. She knew that Buddy was more than just a symbol of the fight. It was a chance for healing, for both her and Carter. The dog had been an anchor, a source of comfort through the darkest moments of her life. But it was also a piece of Carter's past, a living link to the daughter he had lost. In returning Buddy, Sophia offered not just a dog, but a chance at redemption. The meeting between Sophia and Mr. Carter was set in an unexpected location, a small, neutral ground near a city park, far from the prying eyes of the media and public. Sophia arrived first, her step slow but purposeful, with Buddy walking beside her. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the park, and for a moment, the world felt still. When Mr. Carter arrived, he looked different. The carefully maintained facade he had worn for so long had cracked, leaving behind a man who looked defeated, broken. His suit was wrinkled, and his expression was distant, as though he was lost in a memory. "Why are you here?" he asked, his voice hoarse. He had already heard the reports, the news of his fall from grace. But this meeting felt more personal. Sophia looked at him, her gaze steady, her face softening. "I'm here to return Buddy," she said simply. "I'm not asking for anything in return. I want you to have him back." For a moment, Mr. Carter didn't move. His eyes flickered to Buddy, who stood next to Sophia, his tail wagging hesitantly. Then, slowly, he knelt down, reaching out for the dog. As Buddy approached him, the years of pain, loss, and guilt seemed to flood back into Carter's consciousness. He paused before he touched Buddy's fur, his hands trembling. It was as though he'd been transported back to the time when his daughter was alive, when she would have been the one to hold the dog, to laugh and play with him. Tears welled up in Carter's eyes, his throat tightening. He pulled Buddy into his arms, burying his face in the dog's fur. The years of resentment, the walls he had built around his heart, began to crumble. The dog wasn't just a reminder of his past. He was a symbol of everything he had lost, and everything he could still regain if he was willing to change. Sophia stood silently, watching the scene unfold before her. She had expected resistance, but instead, there was only raw emotion. Mr. Carter's composure had shattered, and in its place was a man who was finally confronting the grief he had long suppressed. I never wanted to lose her," Carter whispered, his voice breaking. "Emily, she was everything to me. I failed her. I failed her in so many ways." Sophia felt a pang in her chest. She had never known what it was like to lose a child, but she could feel the depth of his pain. For a moment, she almost reached out to comfort him, but she held herself back. This wasn't about her, it was about him and his journey toward redemption. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, her voice filled with empathy. "But you have to understand what you've been doing to people like me. It's hurting more than just you." Carter looked up at her, his eyes filled with remorse. "I didn't see it. I didn't see what was right in front of me. I thought I thought I could fix everything by building more, by making more money. But I was wrong. I've been wrong all along." Sophia nodded slowly, her heart aching for him. "It's not too late to make it right, but you have to start by changing the way you see people, starting with the ones you've hurt the most." The conversation hung in the air, heavy with the weight of years of regret and misunderstanding. For a long time, neither spoke. But in that silence, something changed. It was as though the two of them had reached an unspoken understanding. They weren't the same people who had started this journey. They had both been transformed. Carter stood up, holding Buddy close. I don't know if I can fix everything," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I'll start. I'll do whatever it takes to make things right." Sophia nodded, her heart swelling with a mix of hope and relief. That's all anyone can ask for. As she turned to leave, she looked back at Mr. Carter, who was standing there, holding Buddy as if the dog had been the missing piece to his broken heart. In that moment, she knew that redemption wasn't just for him. It was for everyone. Sophia walked away, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders. Her fight wasn't over, but this chapter had closed with a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The truth had been told, and lives had been changed. She didn't need to know how it would all end. She only needed to know that for the first time in a long while, things were finally moving in the right direction. The shift in the city's atmosphere was palpable. Mr. Carter, once a symbol of corporate greed and indifference, had become an unlikely advocate for the homeless community. Using his vast influence, he reversed his anti-homeless campaign and instead began funding programs aimed at providing housing, mental health services, job training, and education for those living on the streets. His actions were a public acknowledgement of the harm his past decisions had caused, but also a powerful step toward healing the very community he had once tried to displace. He pledged to work alongside activists, city leaders, and organizations dedicated to the cause, promising to use his resources to make tangible change. For many, his actions were a revelation, proof that even the most hardened individuals could change, that redemption was possible, and that the power to make the world better lay in the hands of those who were willing to confront their mistakes and take responsibility for their past. It wasn't easy, and the public was skeptical at first, but the sincerity in Carter's voice as he spoke about the need for compassion was undeniable. With every donation he made and every program he funded, the city began to see a new side of him, a side driven by a desire to right the wrongs of his past. Sophia watched from the sidelines, still processing the whirlwind of events that had unfolded over the past few months. She had played a part in changing the narrative, but it wasn't just the media coverage or the public outcry that gave her peace. It was the quiet moments of progress, the small victories that were more personal than anything she could have imagined. With Grace's help, Sophia began to rebuild her life. It wasn't easy. The road to recovery was filled with setbacks and challenges, but every step forward was a testament to her resilience. Grace remained by her side, offering support and encouragement. The two women, once strangers brought together by chance, had become steadfast allies. Together, they navigated the bureaucratic hurdles of securing housing, accessing medical care, and rebuilding Sophia's sense of stability. Sophia still found it hard to believe that life was beginning to turn in her favor. After years of surviving on the streets, she had found a place where she could rest, where she could dream again. But it wasn't just the material comforts that mattered. It was a sense of dignity, the sense of being seen as more than just a homeless person, a person with worth, with potential. As she started to rebuild, Sophia realized how profound the simple acts of kindness and justice were. Grace had been her first beacon of light, a person who saw her not as a problem, but as a human being deserving of help. Mr. Carter's eventual change of heart was another crucial lesson, that even those who seem beyond redemption can be transformed through genuine acts of humility and compassion. It wasn't just about giving people shelter. It was about seeing them, acknowledging their humanity, and giving them the tools they needed to rise again. Sophia knew she would never forget where she came from. The streets had shaped her, but they would not define her. The fight for justice, for fairness, and for kindness had become her mission. And in her journey, she found that small acts of kindness, when multiplied, could create ripples of change that reached farther than anyone could have imagined. For Sophia, the real victory wasn't just in the reversal of Mr. Carter's campaign, or in the growing support for homeless programs. The victory was in the hope she now carried with her every day. Hope that, even in the darkest moments, there was always a chance for redemption. Hope that, no matter how far one had fallen, there was always a way back. The story of Sophia, Buddy, Mr. Carter, and Grace was a reminder that kindness mattered, that justice, though often delayed, was worth fighting for, and that the impact of small acts of compassion could echo across lives, communities, and even cities, changing them for the better. In the end, Sophia's journey wasn't just about survival. It was about finding the strength to give, to forgive, and to believe in the power of redemption. And in doing so, she had inspired others to do the same. Sophia stood in the doorway of the newly opened community shelter, her heart swelling with a sense of pride she had never thought possible. It had been a long and arduous journey to get here, but she had made it. With the support of Mr. Carter and Grace, she had transformed a modest, neglected building into a safe haven for the homeless. It was a place where people could find not only shelter, but also a sense of belonging, dignity, and opportunity. The shelter quickly became a beacon of hope in the community. Word spread about Sophia's vision and the collaborative effort behind it, drawing in volunteers, donors, and others who wanted to be part of something meaningful. Mr. Carter had provided the financial backing, using his newfound resources to fund the shelter and its programs. He was there regularly, offering support not just in terms of money, but in the form of hands-on involvement. His transformation was evident in every interaction, every smile shared with those in need. His actions spoke louder than any public statement could have. He was showing, not telling, that change was possible. Grace, too, was there every day, helping to oversee the programs and ensuring that the shelter was a place of warmth and care. She had become more than just a friend to Sophia. She was a partner in this new chapter of life, someone who had never wavered in her belief that people could overcome their struggles with the right support. Together, the three of them had built something meaningful, something that would continue to serve the community long after their efforts were done. As the shelter flourished, Sophia found herself filled with a quiet satisfaction. She had once been just another face on the street, invisible to most. Now, she was a leader, a symbol of resilience and hope. She knew that her work was far from over. There would always be people in need, always more to be done. But for the first time in a long while, she felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. One afternoon, as she was walking through the shelter, checking in on the new arrivals and making sure everyone had what they needed, a familiar sound caught her attention. It was a soft, familiar rustling at the door, followed by the unmistakable sound of a tail wagging. Sophia turned, and her eyes widened with joy. There, standing in the doorway, was Buddy. His fur was gleaming, and he looked healthy and happy, his tail wagging furiously as he trotted over to her. Behind him, a figure stood with a warm, knowing smile. Mr. Carter had come to visit, and Buddy was by his side. The dog's eyes sparkled with recognition as he bounded towards Sophia, his joy evident. It was a moment of pure, unspoken understanding between the two. Buddy had found his place with Mr. Carter, but he had never forgotten Sophia, the one who had saved him. Sophia knelt down, greeting Buddy with a tender pat on the head. She looked up at Mr. Carter, who was watching the reunion with a quiet, appreciative expression. "Looks like he's happy," Sophia said with a smile, her heart full. "He's found his place, just as you have," Mr. Carter replied. "And I think we both owe a lot to him." For a moment, the three of them stood together in the doorway of the shelter, the bond between them palpable. Buddy, once astray, had now found his place in both their lives. He was a reminder of how far they had all come, how much they had all changed. The shelter was thriving, and so was Sophia. She had come from the depths of homelessness, But now she was providing the same support and love to others who were struggling. She was a living testament to the power of kindness, the strength of community, and the impact of standing up for what's right. As the day drew to a close, Sophia watched Buddy and Mr. Carter walk back down the path together. The dog turned back to look at her, his eyes filled with affection and gratitude. Sophia smiled and waved as they disappeared into the distance, knowing that this was how it was supposed to be. The story ended not with a grand speech or an elaborate gesture, but with a simple moment of connection, a reminder that even the smallest acts of kindness could change lives. It was the kind of change that might start with one person, but in the end, it rippled out to touch many. In the quiet of the shelter, surrounded by people who were starting to rebuild their lives, Sophia felt a profound peace settle over her. Her journey had come full circle, and she knew that this was just the beginning. Through unity, compassion, and the willingness to see others as human beings, they had all created something beautiful. And in that moment, she realized that no matter how hard the road had been, every step had been worth it. For the first time in years, she was certain that the world could be a better place, and that she, with the help of others, had played a part in making it so.